the vote was unanimous. That was the part I keep coming back to, not just that they did it, but that not one person at that table hesitated. My grandmother had been buried for exactly 11 days when my older brother called the family meeting. He framed it as a routine business review, the kind our family held every quarter to discuss the vineyard's finances and the next harvest. I drove 3 hours from Portland, ironed my one good blazer, and arrived early the way I always did because being on time was one of the few things in that family I could still control. The conference room at the estate had the same smell it always had, cedar and old wine, and something faintly floral that I'd never been able to identify. My aunt was already seated at the far end. My 2 cousins flanked her like they'd rehearsed the arrangement. My brother stood near the window with his back to me, and when he finally turned around, his expression was the one I'd spent my whole life learning to read, not hostile, not warm, just managed, controlled. The face of a man who had already decided something and was giving you the courtesy of being present for the announcement. I should have left then. I know that now. He waited until everyone settled, until the room achieved the particular quiet of people who are prepared for something uncomfortable. Then he set a folder on the table, slid it toward me, and said that the board had agreed it was time to restructure the vineyard's ownership stake. My grandmother had left things complicated, he said. She hadn't been in the best mental state toward the end. There were some documents that needed to be corrected. He said the word corrected, like it was kind, like he was doing me a favor. Inside the folder was a single page asking me to sign away my 30% share of Callaway Estate Vineyards, established 1962, valued at $43 million. My grandmother had given me that share on my 25th birthday, the same year she taught me how to walk the vines at dawn and read the color of the soil. She called me her reason, which I'd never fully understood until I was standing in that conference room holding a pen I hadn't agreed to pick up. I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. My brother looked at the window instead of at me. My aunt pressed her lips together. One of my cousins studied his phone. Then my brother said that if I refused, the board would move to challenge my grandmother's mental competency at the time of the original transfer. They had a doctor, he said. They had statements. The process would be messy and expensive, and at the end of it I would still lose because they had the votes, and I was a teacher who made $58,000 a year and couldn't afford a real attorney. I looked around that table. 11 days since we buried her. 11 days since I stood at the graveside and held my aunt's hand while she cried. Since my brother gave the eulogy and called our grandmother a visionary, a matriarch, a woman who built something that would outlast all of us. 11 days. I set the pen down and told them I needed time to think. My brother said they needed an answer by the end of the week. I drove back to Portland in the dark, both hands on the wheel, the heater running too loud for the kind of silence I needed. My phone buzzed for an hour, my aunt. One of my cousins, a number I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. When I finally pulled into my parking spot outside my apartment building, I sat in the car for a long time with the engine off. There was an envelope on my windshield. I almost didn't notice it. The night was drizzling, the streetlights doing that orange-gold blur they do in rain, and the envelope was tucked under my wiper blade like a parking notice. I got out because something made me, some instinct that had nothing to do with reason. It was cream-colored, quality paper, with my name written across the front in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. My grandmother had been dead for 11 days. I looked up and down the street. No one. A car turned at the far end of the block and disappeared. I stood in the drizzle with the envelope in my hands, my breath fogging in the November air, and I felt the strangest thing, not fear exactly, more like the sensation that time had just folded backward and I'd missed the seam. Inside was a business card for an attorney named Sylvia Crane, and a note in my grandmother's handwriting that said only, "She has been waiting. Trust her. I chose you for a reason." I called Sylvia Crane at 7 the next morning. She answered on the second ring. Her office was in a building downtown that I'd driven past 100 times without ever noticing. 20th floor, corner suite, a view of the river through floor-to-ceiling windows. Sylvia herself was small and precise, somewhere in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back and reading glasses that she never seemed to put on but always held. She looked at me the way people look at someone they've been expecting, which is different from the way people look at someone they've never met. She shook my hand and said my grandmother spoke of me often, Then she locked the office door. What she showed me over the next 2 hours rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own life. My grandmother had come to Sylvia 14 months earlier, while her health was still good. Not because she was dying, she'd told Sylvia, but because she was paying attention. She'd been watching my brother for 2 years by then, watching the way he managed the Vineyard's books, the vendors he was quietly replacing, the loans he'd taken in the estate's name without presenting them to the full board. She'd hired a private accountant. She'd documented everything. She was also watching my cousin, who had started having conversations with a development firm about converting the northern 40 acres into condominiums, conversations that no one else in the family knew about. My grandmother had built Callaway from a single acre of rocky hillside soil. She'd done it alone after my grandfather left when my mother was 7. She'd never sold a single parcel, never borrowed more than she could repay, never taken a partner she didn't trust. And she had spent the last 14 months making sure that the person who inherited her life's work was someone my brother could not control. Sylvia placed a folder on the desk between us. Inside was a trust document, not the one my family had presented to me. Not the standard estate filing I'd assumed existed, but a separate structure Sylvia had prepared under a different jurisdiction. A protective trust, designed to be invisible until it needed not to be. My 30% stake had been quietly reinforced inside it 18 months ago, and the trust contained something else, a sealed secondary deed transferring an additional controlling interest enough to reach 51% from my grandmother to me, with a trigger clause activating on her death. I stared at the documents until the words stopped swimming. I asked her why she hadn't contacted me sooner. Sylvia said my grandmother had been specific. She didn't want me to carry the knowledge while she was still alive. She was afraid I would show it on my face, and she knew my brother read faces the way other people read ledgers methodically, looking for discrepancies. I asked how my grandmother knew my brother would move against me. Sylvia set her glasses on the desk and said she didn't know for certain, but she had found a loan document, signed with my grandmother's signature that she had never agreed to. She'd found it by accident, going through the quarterly statements her accountant had flagged. The signature wasn't forged exactly, Sylvia said, choosing the word carefully. It was reproduced. The kind of reproduction that happens when someone has access to a signature stamp. The room felt very still. There's a moment in certain conversations when you realize the ceiling has been lower than you thought your entire life. You've been walking bent at the knee without knowing it. I sat in Sylvia's office and felt that ceiling lift, and the air that came in with it was cold and clarifying and nothing like relief. I asked what I was supposed to do. She told me to go to the estate. My grandmother's private study on the 2nd floor of the main house had been locked since the week she died. My brother had said it needed to be inventoried carefully, that there were sensitive business documents, that he would handle it. He had the key. I assumed because he always had the key to everything in that house, because he'd made himself indispensable to my grandmother in ways that looked like love but functioned like positioning. Sylvia handed me a key. She said my grandmother had given her a copy years ago. She said the study contained something she had been instructed not to describe, but that I would understand when I saw it. I drove to the estate that afternoon. The vineyard in November is stripped and quiet, the vines brown and geometric against the gray hills. The whole property wrapped in the particular stillness of something resting between seasons. I'd always loved it this way, honestly. The summer crowds and harvest energy were beautiful, but November was when the land felt honest. The house was empty. My brother lived 40 minutes away and wasn't expected until the weekend. I let myself in with the code my grandmother had never changed, the one she'd given me the year I turned 20 and started spending summers helping with the harvest, and I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The study smelled like her. Lavender and old paper and a faint trace of the tea she drank every afternoon. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I could make myself go in. The desk was neat the way it always was, stacks of folders labeled in her precise handwriting. A framed photograph of the vineyard taken from the eastern ridge, the angle that made the rows look like brushstrokes. A ceramic mug she'd had since before I was born. I sat down in her chair and opened the top drawer. Beneath a series of labeled folders, taxes, insurance, harvest records, was a slim journal bound in dark green cloth. My name was written inside the cover in the same handwriting as the envelope on my windshield. And beneath the journal, wrapped carefully in a plastic sleeve, was a document. I looked at the document first. It was a will. Not the will that had been filed with the estate attorney after my grandmother's death, not the one my brother had referenced in the meeting, but an earlier draft dated 3 years ago. This version had different numbers, different distribution, a different executor. And in the margin beside my name, in faint pencil that someone had tried to erase but not successfully, were 2 words in my brother's handwriting. Change this. I set it down and opened the journal. She wrote the way she talked, which is to say plainly and without sentimentality, but sometimes a plain sentence can hit harder than a decorated one. The first entry was dated almost 2 years before she died. She described finding the loan document with the reproduced signature. She described the conversation she'd had with my brother when she asked him about it, the way he deflected, the way he smiled, that particular smile she'd seen on him since he was a teenager, the one that meant he believed he already knew the outcome of a situation. She wrote, "He has confused patience with permission. He thinks because I am quiet I do not see." I turned the pages slowly. She had been watching for a long time. The journal tracked a pattern I wouldn't have recognized from any single piece of it, but laid out across 18 months of careful entries it became unmistakable. The vendors replaced without board approval, the silent conversations with the development firm, the gradual way my brother had positioned himself as the single point of contact between my grandmother and the estate's legal counsel, so that by the time she died, he was the one who knew which attorneys to call and which records to present. There was an entry about me. She had written it 8 months before she died, on a Tuesday in March, which I knew because she always dated her entries precisely. She wrote that she'd watched me walk the North Vineyard at dawn without knowing she was there. She wrote that I'd stopped at the diseased row, the one the head farmer had been arguing needed to be pulled and replanted, and knelt down and looked at the soil for a long time. She wrote that she watched me take a photograph of the root exposure and make a note on my phone, and that I'd done it the way a person does something when no one is looking and they're doing it for the thing itself and not for being seen doing it. She wrote, "She is the one who will not sell it." My vision blurred. I pressed my fingers against my eyes and breathed through it and then kept reading. The final entry in the journal was dated 1 week before she went into the hospital for the last time. She had written about Sylvia. She had written about the trust. She had written a single line at the bottom of the page that I've carried with me every day since. I could not protect everything, but I could protect her. I sat in her chair in her study for a long time. Then I heard a car in the driveway. My brother wasn't supposed to be there until the weekend, but the car was his. I'd watched him drive that same model for 7 years, and the sound of the engine was as familiar to me as his voice. I slid the journal and the document back into the drawer, closed it, and stood up. I looked around the room and felt the specific kind of calm that comes when you've moved past being afraid and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. He appeared in the doorway of the study and went very still when he saw me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I had known my brother my entire life. I had watched him charm and manage and strategize his way through every situation I'd ever seen him in. But I had also watched my grandmother, and she had taught me, without ever saying so directly, to look for the thing behind the management, to look for what the calm was covering. He was afraid. Not of me, exactly. Of what I might have found. He asked what I was doing there. I told him I was going through her things. He stepped into the room and his eyes went immediately to the desk and then to the drawer, and that told me everything I needed to confirm. He knew what was in there. He had probably planned to come back for it himself this week, before I or anyone else could get to it. He told me this wasn't a good time for me to be going through her personal papers without the family present. I asked him if he meant the family that voted to take my share of the estate 11 days after burying her. He said it wasn't personal. He said the board had to make decisions that were best for the long-term health of the company. He said my grandmother had made a lot of decisions in her later years that the family had to consider in context. I asked him what context that was. He took a step toward the desk and I moved so that I was between him and it. And something shifted in his expression, then a crack in the management. And for just a moment he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent years maneuvering around a woman he underestimated and was now realizing the underestimation had been mutual. He told me to step aside. I told him to call his attorney. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh people use when they want to signal that something isn't worth taking seriously. He told me I couldn't afford to fight this. He told me I had a mortgage in Portland and a teaching salary and no idea what a protracted legal battle actually cost. He said these things gently, like they were facts he was sorry to have to share. I told him I'd already spoken to Sylvia Crane. The laugh stopped. I watched the name register, watched him work through what it meant that I knew the name, that I'd made the call, that I was standing in this room having clearly already found what was in the drawer. The management didn't disappear, but it cracked further, and through the crack I saw something I hadn't expected to see. Not just fear, but something older. The face of someone who had told himself a story about this situation for a very long time and was now watching the story fail. He said Sylvia Crane had worked for my grandmother, and that her interests were biased, and that any documents she'd presented to me would be challenged in court. I told him he was welcome to challenge the trust documents. I told him he was also welcome to explain the loan with the reproduced signature to the estate judge. I told him that the draft will I'd found in the drawer with his handwriting in the margin would be part of the record. He was quiet for a long time. The vineyard outside the window was still and gray and patient. I thought about my grandmother kneeling in the soil. I thought about her watching me walk the north row without knowing she was there. I thought about the years I'd spent at that estate learning everything she was willing to teach me, while my brother learned different lessons, the ones about maneuvering, about positioning, about getting to the outcome before anyone else understood what was happening. He had learned the wrong things from her. Or rather, he had watched her and seen only the strategy and missed everything underneath it. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted the deed. I told him I wanted the loan removed from the estate's liability. I told him I wanted him to withdraw the competency challenge he'd been preparing. And I told him that in exchange for those things, I would give him time, a reasonable transition period before I moved to restructure the board. He said I couldn't do that. He said he had votes. I told him that I owned 51% of the estate, and that the trust document Sylvia had filed in a different jurisdiction 3 days after my grandmother's death was already part of the public record in that county. I told him that he had 2 options: negotiate with me now, or have his attorney call Sylvia's attorney and spend the next 2 years in litigation over forged documents and fraudulent loan filings. He stood in the doorway of his grandmother's study and he looked at me, and I think he saw something he hadn't seen before, not defiance exactly, because I'd been defiant with him before, and he'd always found a way around it. Something more permanent. The look of a person who had found the ground under their feet and wasn't going to be moved off it. He left without saying anything else. Sylvia filed the formal documentation the following Monday. My brother's attorney called hers on Wednesday. The negotiation took 3 weeks. It was not pleasant, and it was not simple, and there were moments in the middle of it when I sat in my apartment at 2 a.m. with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and thought about how much easier it would have been to sign that paper in the conference room. How much quieter, how much less of everything. Then I would think about my grandmother kneeling in the soil. I would think about her sitting in that study, writing her careful, plain sentences while her granddaughter walked a vineyard at dawn. I would think about her choosing me and all the things she must have known when she did. The agreement was finalized on a Thursday morning in December, 22 days before the anniversary of her death. My brother retained a 15% non-voting financial stake, the minimum structure that allowed the family to avoid the public litigation he'd been threatened with. My aunt and cousins retained their smaller shares unchanged. The development firm conversations were terminated formally and in writing. The loan with the reproduced signature was removed from the estate's books and referred to the county attorney's office, which is still pending as of the time I'm telling you this. I drove to the estate the afternoon the paperwork was finalized. November had given way to December, and the vineyard was completely bare now, the rows running straight and brown to the horizon under a sky the color of pewter. I parked in the main lot and walked out to the north end, the one with the diseased row I'd photographed that morning my grandmother had watched me without my knowing. The row had been pulled and replanted the previous fall. Young vines now, barely the height of my knee, planted in the soil my grandmother had built from almost nothing over 40 years. They wouldn't produce for 3 more seasons. I stood there for a long time. In the spring, I moved into the main house. My brother and I don't speak except through attorneys, and that is probably how it will stay. My aunt sent a card in January that said she hoped I knew she had always loved me, which I chose to believe without requiring it to mean more than it did. My cousins have kept their distance, which is its own kind of clarity. The head farmer, a man named Dale who had worked the vineyard since before I was born, met me in the drive my first morning there with a cup of coffee and a list of everything he thought needed attention before spring. He didn't congratulate me or express an opinion about what had happened. He just handed me the list. It was 7 pages long. I said thank you. He said my grandmother had told him I'd figure out the rest. I asked when she'd told him that. He thought for a second and said 2 winters ago, when I was walking the vines at dawn and she was watching from the ridge. He said she came back down and told him to make sure the north row got fixed before I took over, because he knew how I felt about not finishing a job correctly. I stood in the cold driveway holding my coffee, and for just a moment the grief hit me fresh and hard the way it does sometimes when you aren't braced for it. Not the grief of losing her, I'd lived in that for months, but a different kind. The grief of all the conversations we hadn't had. All the mornings I hadn't known she was watching. All the things she'd seen in me and carried quietly for years without saying them out loud, because she knew I'd need to find it on my own. I went inside and made breakfast. Then I sat down at her desk, my desk now, I supposed, and opened the harvest schedule for the coming year. The vines in the north row won't produce for 3 more seasons, but they're in the ground. They're growing. And when the time comes, I'll be here. My grandmother built this place alone on a single acre of rocky hillside soil, and she did it because she believed the land deserved someone who would stay. I used to think that was a simple thing she was saying. I understand now that it wasn't simple at all. It was the whole thing. It was everything. I'm staying.